This is your Irish Diary, presenting the romance and reality of Irish life then and now. Auric Éireann, or Irish Diary, is presented by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation of St. Paul. Professor John McKiernan of the College of St. Thomas in St. Paul is writer and narrator.
Would a rose be just the same by any other name? What is the romance and mystery of names? We'd like to talk to you about Irish names, not about all names or names in general, although obviously, since the Irish are human or remarkably similar facsimile, we would expect that many of the things that are true about Irish names would be true about names in general. Certainly there's a mystery surrounding names. We know amongst primitive peoples, for instance, the name is held very, very sacred. And we know that amongst the ancient Jews, the name of God was much too sacred to be mentioned. What then can we say about Irish names, about names that are so familiar to you all, that are so popular in this country? I suppose we might begin with the origin of Irish names. According to Irish tradition, Irish names were legislated. I'm talking, of course, about surnames. Irish names were legislated by Brian Boru, the great king, or the emperor, as he signed his name himself, Imperator Scotorum, the emperor of the Irish. This great king who died in 1014, right at the dawn of the 11th century. That, however, is only tradition. We do know that surnames had come into use in Ireland before his time. I'll give you an example, for instance, of O'Clery. Most of you have heard the name O'Clery, either in its proper form, O'Clery, or just with the Cleary or Clary form of it, which is quite popular today. This particular name, this surname, has been in use in Ireland since the 900s. Now, that's 1,000 years or a slight bit better than that. And believe me, there are few royal families in Europe that can boast of a continuity like that. So that we do know that about this period, the 10th and the 11th century in Ireland, surnames, hereditary surnames, came to be very popular. Now, up to the middle of the 17th century, however, there were many families in the lower economic bracket in Ireland who still made no use of surnames. As a matter of fact, this was true in other parts of Europe as well. But you know, today we're inclined to take for granted that one has the same name as his father, and it's as simple as that. It's like running water, one doesn't inquire about it. But we do know that as late as the middle of the 17th century, perhaps it's very difficult to make an estimate, but we might say 20 to 30%, possibly not that large, of the families in Ireland still made no use of an hereditary surname. Now, in talking about the origins, possibly we ought to get rid of two myths right at the beginning. One is the Mac myth. So many people who are well-disposed and well-intentioned in regard to names, so many people are quick to say, well, if it's Mac, M-A-C, obviously it's Scottish. And if it's M-C, it's Irish. Nothing could be falser. Nothing could be any more removed from the truth. Because Mac, M-A-C, pronounced in Irish Mac, simply means son. and it is in use both in Ireland and Scotland, since they both speak what is, after all, the same language, so that the word for son is the same. Well then, why is it in some places written MC? That's only an abbreviation. There may be Irish who don't know that, although I'm not inclined to believe that the Irish wouldn't know it. But it's a common myth or mistake that is made in regard to names. So we've removed that. The second myth is the myth of spelling. Some people, you know, will say, well, my name is O'Neill, but it's O-N-E-A-L, and someone says mine is N-E-I-L-L, and someone else is going to say mine is N-I-A-L-L. Or, to make it worse, someone is likely to say, well, yours is N-E-I-L-L, but mine is N-E-I-L. I have only one L. Now, the second myth, then, is the myth of spelling. I'd like, however, to enter a word of caution. It is quite possible that certain differences are indicated by a difference in spelling. But on the whole, spelling is of utterly no importance. Maybe we ought to pass that along to some of the, say, 8th graders or something of that, someone of that degree. Spelling has assumed a great importance in our time, and I'm not going to give a disquisition on spelling. And it's important to us, shall we say, for social reasons. But in the history, to insist that there's a real historic difference necessarily because there's a difference in the spelling, well, no, this is really going a little bit too far. So shall we say then that we have rid ourselves of two myths? First of all, if a name is Mac and another one is MC, this does not mean one is Scots and the other is Irish. But it means that it can be, either name can be Irish. Secondly, we've talked about the spelling, we've talked long enough. Now, if spelling isn't important, at least isn't that important, what might be? Now, what might be important in Irish names is the territory associated with the name. Certain names, for instance, have become localized. The O'Neills, for instance, are a great northern name. So too are the O'Donnells. This part of the country could really be called O'Donnell land. And this part could be called O'Neill land. And over here we can speak of the Joyce country. And down around here of the Coins. And we have names then that are peculiar to, we're on this section of the country, the McNamara's, for instance. So in the history of Irish names, the place is of considerable importance. And it's much, much more important that you get into an argument, if necessary, about the place that your grandmother or great-grandfather came from, rather than about the spelling. The spelling, you see, is a modern problem, and it's of no great importance. But the place, that means something, because in Irish traditions, families have been localized so long in one spot, and this is true even today. A registry, for instance, of names that was completed in 1894, when compared with 1964, shows us the predominance of names in certain localities hasn't changed appreciably, despite the fact that we're living in such a faster age. Well, how then did the Irish names originate? Well, in some respects, they originated much as other names, but there are slight differences according to the Irish temperament and to the Irish history. So let us review the several different ways in which names originated in Ireland. And we'll use as examples names that are familiar to you all, I hope. The first of these methods, or first of these origins, we might call that of the patronymic. That is, one takes his name from his father. I'm not talking now, of course, of taking the surname. I'm talking about the time when surnames didn't exist. So that one took that name by which his father was known. For instance, we have McCafferty, to take an Irish name. This means this is simply the son of Godfrey, Mac Goffrey. Mac, M-A-C, son. Goffrey, the Irish of Godfrey, Mac Goffrey became McCaffrey. We have names like O'Callahan. And again, the man who responsible for the root of the name was Callahan, who was a descendant of a 10th century king. So you see, we take a Mac or we take an O. Now, is there any distinction? Well, Mac means son. What does O mean? O means grandson or beyond. In other words, could be a great-grandson. So it's a little bit looser lineal mark, if you will. There's a very interesting distinction here made in connection with the Normans. When the Normans came to Ireland at the end of the 12th century and on into the 13th and so on, they were quickly absorbed into Irish life. And indeed, it's very true that these people who came as invaders soon became indistinguishable in their patriotism from the native Irish. Now, they took the Irish custom often in regard to names, so that we have a man, let's say, by the name of Jordan Dexeter, D apostrophe, Jordan Dexeter, whose descendants called themselves Mac Jordan or Mac Shurtan, as it was in Irish. So you see, a Dexeter becomes a Mac Jordan. This name isn't very common in Ireland, but it occurs often enough in documents, and sometimes in our time appears in an anglicized form, Mac Shurtan. So that's a slight example of the Normans taking over the Irish custom. Of course, the Normans did this in other respects. Fitzgerald, Fitz, the Norman rough equivalent of the Irish Mac, Fitz was replaced, and Fitzgerald became Mac Gerald, son of Gerald. So that one way then is the name originates in the patronymic. A second way is that a name might take its origin in a place. This is very common in England, but it's rather uncommon in Ireland. For instance, you do have a few names like Mead, which can be Irish and means now not a particular town, but it means a general area, a man from that area known as Meath. Then, for instance, a man might take his name from trade. This happens all over the world. We have coopers and wrights and millers and bakers and so on. But this, again, this was not as common in Ireland as it was in some other countries. But, and this might interest you, when you come across a McGowan, you are now talking about a man whose name was founded on trade, because the Gaelic Gowa means smith. So that actually many of the McGowans had their names translated into English and they became known as Smiths. So that your Irish Smiths aren't going to argue about whether it's S-M-I or S-M-Y or whether it's S-M-Y-T-H or S-M-Y-T-H-E, because most of them are descended from McGowans. Well, there are three ways so far: patronymics, places, and trades. Now, personal characteristics is a very interesting one, and this is a fruitful source in Irish of names, a very fruitful source. And we have names that may not look too Irish, a name like B-E-G-G, Beg. But actually it's quite Irish because it comes from the Irish word for small, beg, which means small. And we have names like Duff, D-U-F-F. Now, I'm not talking about Duffy, but D-U-F-F, Duff. And again, it comes from the Irish adjective duv, which means dark. So that you see there are names coming from personal characteristics, from adjectives applying to people. But then there are other sorts of names that come from personal characteristics too, that aren't in that particular class, not adjectives exactly, but derivatives of noun formations. Take the name, for instance, O'Flynn. And of course, Flynn, obviously, in its original form was O'Flynn. And take the name Flanagan. Both of these have as their root the Irish word which means ruddy. So that somewhere along the line you see a ruddy complexioned man transferred his name, if you will, or at least his description was preserved in the name that his son adopted. And names like McMahon come from the Irish word for bear, B-E-A-R. And someplace along in there, you see, there's a bit of history tied up. Take a name like O'Maloney, as Maloney ought to be known, I suppose, historically. And now this means the son of the servant of the church. So it's a, shall we say, a social characteristic of that man rather than an element of his personal description. In some way or other, that servant of the church was distinguished for his kindness and generosity to the church, so that this was preserved in the name Maloney. Or take O'Shea, from the Irish word for hawk. In other words, the O'Shea, someplace along there was a man who was hawk-like, that is very brave, dauntless, you see. Now, then that's preserved in O'Shea. And there's a very lovely story about the O'Sullivans, but this is probably getting into the area of pure legend. But you see, O'Sullivan in Irish, theoretically at any rate, it seems to be Sul I Awan, one or alone, one eye alone. And this takes us back to the legends about the O'Sullivans and their great generosity, and how one of them one time was tested, had his generosity tested in this particular way. Knowing that an O'Sullivan was so generous that he would give whatever was asked for, a stranger one day asked an O'Sullivan for his eye, an eye, and it was plucked out and given to the stranger. And this is the legendary origin. On the other hand, O'Sullivan, one-eyed, might also mean that he was hawk-eyed or something of that sort. Or take the name O'Maher, or as it's more commonly pronounced in the United States, Mar, as though it were M-A-R. The name now that is spelled M-A-H-E-R or M-E-A-G-H-E-R, Maher. This comes from the Irish word for hospitable. So then we've demonstrated that some names come from personal characteristics or social qualities or something of that sort. The last way in which the names in Ireland have had their origins is through the course of invasions or immigrations into the country. Now, obviously, when the Normans came, they produced an effect upon the names of the people because they came to stay. Unlike the Danes, they were much more influential in Irish life. Their names remain behind them, and a very common one, for instance, is Walsh, which means Welsh. And these people came from Wales, the Normans, so that the very name Walsh in Irish, the Irish form is Branagh, means a man from Wales. Other names, for instance, Norman names that have become very Irish are Burke, de Bourgo, de Burca in Irish, Fitzgerald, of course, I've mentioned before, Macgerald. But here's an interesting one, Costello, or, to pronounce it more correctly, Costello. Costello now, this is, I think, yes, it is the first recorded change from a Norman name to a Mac, because in Irish it's Muck. It is preceded by the Muck. Other names like Power and Wall, these are very Irish names with a long history in Ireland, but Norman in their origin. So now the origins of Irish names then: patronymics, places, trades, personal characteristics, and invasions. And of these, the most important then, I should think, are probably the personal characteristics, which passed on then in the form of patronymics. These are the most common sources, so that if one is familiar enough with Old Irish and with genealogy, he can come up with a very interesting legendary history, at any rate, about his own name. Well then, how did the changes occur? And what were these changes? Well, I suppose it's quite obvious that the greatest change is that these names are in English, because this is, well, proof right there in front of you. Every time you see a name like this in English, it's proof of the success of the English conquest, because the names in English, with rare exceptions, don't look and don't sound too much like their Irish originals. So that absolutely the greatest effect then upon the change was the substitution of languages, the fact that English was imposed upon the Irish, and indeed, especially at the end of the 19th century, very willingly accepted by them. Well, that's one change, or perhaps I should say most of the changes go back to that. To be much more specific, changes came in this way specifically. First of all, many names were translated into English. Muckgowan was translated into Smith. Looks very much different, but the same name. Macion, now that's a Gaelic name, Macion, and it sometimes exists in many different spellings in English: M-C-K-E-O-N, K-E-O-W-N, and other. This has an origin to either of two Irish forms, Maceoin, Maceon, and one of these forms is translated into English as Johnson. Now, that seems to be a thoroughly English name, and indeed it is, but it can also be Irish, translated from its original form. Secondly, we might mention, and this was a very prolific, fruitful cause, phonetics. Most of the Irish names were spelled, and this is why the spelling is generally speaking of so little importance. Most of the Irish names were spelled in English as they sounded to the English ear. And Murphy, for instance, Machmurchu, and that's a name again that should have a Mach or an O. Machmurchu, well, Murphy came out of that. Names, for instance, like O'Kelly, O'Cally, it is in Irish, and the spelling, of course, is tremendously different. O-C-E-A-L-L-A-I-G-H. But Kelly is fairly close. How about this one? Dunphy, D-U-N-P-H-Y. Dunphy from O'Donoghue, O'Donoghue, the Irish form. Or Clancy, which was given as the rough phonetics of Maclanchi. Well, we had some names translated. We had many more of them spelled in English as the English ear received them. In some instances, we had the Irish were just renamed. The English, in that particular instance, couldn't make anything of the name and said, okay, your name is such and such, and gave him a name they were familiar with or another name. In some fewer instances, there was a process which we call assimilation. That is, a name like Kehilly, K-E-H-I-L-L-Y, Kehilly, became Kelly. It seemed to be so similar. The difference isn't much in English, but in Irish it's quite a bit. Fihilly became Feely. Sullivan became Sullivan. And this is interesting. Blowick became Blake. Then there was another way in which the names changed. For instance, a linguistic change, illustrated by what I said before about the Mar, how Maher becomes Mar. And this was commonly done by inserting an extra consonant on the end of a name. So the Irish name O'Higgin became Higgins, and the Irish name Bolan, or Bolan in Irish, became B-O-L-A-N-D in English. So then we've had translations, phonetics, renaming, assimilation, where a name similar is taken up, assimilated to one more common, linguistic changes, and then finally the most important, we had a social change taking place. That is, when the Irish were beaten in the 17th century, many of them, understandably, became somewhat ashamed of their backgrounds. They wanted to hide their backgrounds as much as possible so that they could get on better in the world. And they began dropping the Macs and the O's, so that people whose name, let's say, was MacMurrachu, Mac Murphy, became Murphy, and people whose names were O'Kelly became Kelly. And there were other more distant changes. People whose names, for instance, were Mac Guilfoyle became Powell. Mac Guilfoyle means son of the servant of Paul. So they became Powell. Now, these are understandable changes, but some of them are a bit hard for us to recognize today. The name Whalen, for instance, seems to us as though it never had an O in front of it. And yet it's one of those names which properly should be O, Whelon. Now, what we have tried to do then is give a very quick sketch of the origins of the names and how they changed. And I think one of the most humorous aspects of the whole thing is the change that has taken place again in the 20th century. I'll give you this in just a moment's sketch. For instance, names like Connell, Connor, Ryan, Kelly, names like these, which always had a Gaelic prefix to them, most of them O, the ones I have mentioned, had these prefixes dropped in the 17th, 18th, or 19th century. But in the 20th century, the early part of this, with that growing nationalism developing in Ireland, the extraordinary thing was most of these were restored. So whereas in the 19th century, most of the O'Kellys were Kellys, now in the 1960s, we find most of them are O'Kellys. So you see, things change in the world, and even names tell a lot.
If you would like a list of selected readings to add to your enjoyment, please send a self-addressed stamped envelope to Professor John McKiernan, College of St. Thomas, St. Paul, Minnesota. This program has been presented as a public service by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation and produced at KTCA-TV, Minneapolis, St. Paul.